thank you all for joining us. This has been it's been a privilege for me to participate in the sessions this morning. A fantastic panel we have now. What we want to do now is we're going to do a quick roundtable, but what we'd really like to do is have everybody who's listening participate as well. I think you're able to indicate to the moderator that you'd like to go on camera and speak as well. But what we want to do is come up with at least 10 action items, 10 recommendations for the new administration in terms of how to address the issues that we've been talking about. 5G, broadband for all, a digital New Deal. We've talked about being behind as a country. We started with South Korea this morning. We've talked about the fact that this is a completely new economic paradigm. We've talked about the fact that everybody in the country, just like they deserve clean water, they deserve access to high-speed broadband. We've had really interesting projects from the far north Indian Reservation in the state of Washington, Tennessee, Arizona, other projects around the country. General Spalding talked about a 5G setup that he's put together, new technology to address rural 5G opportunities and the security issues, which are top of mind over the last couple of days. So we really, we've got a big chunk of the national economy, a big chunk of the infrastructure economy in front of us. And, I guess I sense that it would be really great to have some recommendations for the Biden folks and hopefully get them to pay attention to some of the recommendations. Derrick, why don't we start with you? And I promised everybody that we'd be brief as a way to catalyze a general conversation. But what would your recommendation be, and what's your biggest issue, and what's your biggest issue that needs to be addressed?
Thanks, Norm. We've talked about this, you and I, directly, but I think that in terms of perspective, that the administration could use a different type of approach, right? Since we're talking about completely new tools, completely new outcomes, instead of looking at, well, we won't say it that way. We should look at the return on impact. We need impact metrics, right? And then some sort of threshold by which we can start to say, here's what impact does as a multiplier, right? And then start with, in assigning those metrics, start with the lowest common denominator, right? Which is the thing that would push everyone. My issue is that many times the approach is towards the areas, the places that already have the most juice get the most attention. Right. And if we start looking in some of these communities that have the most need, any finance person will tell you that's our greatest opportunity for return, right? So I would like to be able to get the administration to do a head count, as we were talking about earlier, a head count on all the disenfranchised peoples and areas, and focus there on impact metrics. Yeah, that's about it. I think that's what we should do.
Great. Okay, so that's one recommendation, and we're going to come back to that, I think, because what we're going to do is get people to participate from throughout. So that's a good start. Shelley, why don't we go with you? Tell us a little bit about what you do and what you'd like to see happen.
Sure. I'm the Broadband Program Director for the Public Works Board. We're a new program. We were just created in 2019 and funded for the first time in 2019. The whole broadband effort is relatively new to the state of Washington. We've had a broadband office in the past, but it's finally been funded with something more than just federal grant funds. So what our focus is to really deliver to unserved areas, and by unserved in our statute, it's 25.3 or less. Our goal is 25.3 to all homes in the state of Washington, 1 gig service to all businesses by 2026, and then 150 symmetrical by 2028. Lofty goals. What we see, and I think this is characteristic of most states, is that we have the federal programs, but how they effectively work, while providing some services to these rural areas that have a low return on investment, they don't provide services in the time frame that folks need it, and the goals are pretty low. And so our communities are behind continuously and struggling to catch up. And again, there just really is no incentive for folks to come in and provide services. So what we're doing with our program is really looking at it as a grassroots, so working with communities, helping them plan for broadband deployment and helping them prepare for our application process, and then helping them get through that. Our first cycle opened in July. We had 73 million in requests. We had 17.8 million in available funding, a difference of 300%. So you can see, and that's just the ones that tapped in for our first application cycle. Tremendous need. To kind of piggyback Derrick a little bit, I kind of believe that we need to look at broadband differently, and the return on investment needs to be shifted, because if you're looking at it strictly from a dollars perspective, some of these areas are never going to pencil out. So how do we bridge that gap when all of the funding at the federal level is really kind of geared toward private entities, and then of course it takes them years to build out, and we have examples all over the state of fiber, particularly in our tribal areas, fiber that's passed through the reservation to serve other more lucrative areas, and it never gets built out. So we have to shift how we think about that investment and the return on investment, and really with a thought geared toward how it impacts, again, with Derrick's comments, how it impacts our communities, and finding a way to describe that, because I think of it as really supporting the cultural identity of our rural areas. And I think that's a really valuable thing.
Good. Yeah, I think that's great. Brian, could you give us your 60-second spiel in terms of action items and what you do?
Sure. I work for the Rural Utilities Service, which is under the rural development part of the USDA. And what we do is we offer loans and grants for broadband and telephone companies to build out in rural areas, as well as distance learning and telemedicine, which obviously you need connectivity to make those work properly. But that's our focus. We have Reconnect, which has been our big program of late, and that's where areas with service less than 10.3 could receive funds through a competitive scoring process to build out service of at least 25.3. And so that's kind of, really where our focus is at, is in broadband, and it's providing it to households, not just to businesses. But we care what kind of service do the individual households have. Those are the people that are extremely impacted, and so getting them that service is important for us as an agency. I think as far as an action item, I still think that middle mile through areas that are rural, as opposed to just major throughways, is what's going to be able to change things, and to where things can start spidering out. As you build out middle mile, then you can have other smaller entities be created for ISPs, wireless. Really, there's multiple ways to do it, but once you have that middle mile within a reasonable distance, it becomes way more cost effective for those entities to get started or to continue service. And in 2018 Farm Bill, there was some language that does allow for middle mile. And so really, once those regs come about and are finalized, hopefully, that's something we can start offering loans and grants for.
Let me ask you guys a question before we go to Matt, and then we'll get to Zachary. But, Shelley, you talk about 25.3, and Brian, you talk about, support to people above 10.3, but that's still pretty slow, right? I mean, That's like having semi-clean water in my world, right? It's like you're not going to have fresh water, but most of the time you won't get sick. I mean, that's pretty slow. Should one of the action items be more ambitious than that in terms of nationwide broadband? And if it is,
I think nationwide, yes. But when you're talking about rural areas that don't have anything, you know, you got to start somewhere, and you don't want the money going to an area that already has service versus someone who doesn't really have service. So that's kind of how, and we sort of adapt in our you know, it used to be 5-1 for one of our programs, then it went to 10-1. And then I'm hopeful in the next round, possibly of Reconnect, that might be bumped up to 25-3. And as we move along and move up, we see less applications, which shows that demand is at a new level, and therefore the amounts are generally increased, as you're talking about. But me personally, yeah, I think it should or could be higher. We do offer extra points for maybe someone who's offering gig service or something like that. So there's incentive for higher scoring for the funds to go to those entities.
Yeah, here in Washington, we've really focused on hitting those higher targets. So with our application process, you know, we were looking for readiness, community support, and then of course scalability. So while it may not be possible right out of the gate to get up to 150 symmetrical in an area that's currently unserved, we want to see a project that is scalable to those higher goals, so that we're not always chasing our tails here with broadband service. We want to get those services and equalize them between the urban and rural areas. So that's the focus.
That seems to make sense to me. Matt, I'm going to put you right in the middle of this discussion here.
Well, thanks, Norman. It's great to join you and everyone else this morning. And I guess good segue, because that was one of my recommendations. By way of introduction, I should probably say I'm Matt Schmit, the Office of Broadband Director for the state of Illinois. I come to Illinois by way of Minnesota, though, where I was a legislator and worked on creating our Office of Broadband and matching grant program almost a decade ago there. But everything I'm going to say now is from the Illinois perspective. And I think first and foremost, you know, both states, but certainly Illinois, we index our definition of broadband to that of the FCC. Just for, I think, you know, partnership and collaboration, keeping things in sync. I would highly recommend that we take another look at increasing that definition at the federal level and recalibrate, I think, how we talk about broadband, and also in ways that go beyond speeds. And so that's a whole other conversation there, but I think quality, performance are really important aspects of that definition as well. In Illinois, we're really fortunate because we have, I think, the nation's largest competitive matching grant program. $400 million was devoted to our Connect Illinois grant program. We had $50 million go out the door back in June. Another $50 million application window is open now through March 1st. The point is, that's a huge investment for a state to make, but we can't possibly meet our goals in Illinois if we don't have the kind of partnership from the federal government that we need in order to do that. And so our goals for their part, we feel are achievable. By 2024, we want to have access at the 25/3 level to all homes, businesses, community anchor institutions around the state. We also have a more ambitious goal by 2028 of 100/20 service. Obviously, the pandemic, I think, you know, calls into question the adequacy of all of those goals. The one thing that we do emphasize, though, is any investment that we're making through Illinois dollars scalable to at least 100 symmetrical service. So we're investing in fiber, scalable infrastructure for the long haul. One recommendation I would leave folks with here is, you know, as we're looking forward to hopefully an infrastructure investment, block grants to the states. I've been talking about it for 10 years now, and I think it would be a game changer for states like Illinois, and particularly for states that don't have the resources we have. Love what USDA is doing. We'd love to see more of it. We'd also love to see more federal dollars coming straight to offices like ours. So sorry I went over there, but that's my 2 cents here this morning.
No, that's fine. Explain more what you mean by block grants to states in terms of broadband. How would that work?
Yeah, well, for instance, if a state has taken the steps to have a broadband task force or a council, they've given thought to their goals in their state for what they want to achieve on the broadband front. And if they have an Office of Broadband, if they're administering grants already, I think they're in a great position to receive federal dollars and do more of that kind of grant making that we think makes a world of difference. And so from my perspective, I think our states tend to be closest to the challenges within those states, understand our communities, the nuances from whether it's tribal areas or that rural metro tension that's alive in every state, but it's a little different from one state to the next. I would welcome the opportunity for that kind of partnership with the federal government. And that's not to say that we shouldn't see less of what USDA is doing, because I absolutely love their projects. I'd love to see more of them. But on the same hand, I'd like to see more direct funding for states. And again, for our purposes, if we were able to leverage federal dollars to pair with our Connect Illinois dollars on the outset and plan accordingly, that path to meeting our goal becomes so much clearer as we look to the out years. And so I really hope that the momentum is building for doing this. I'm hearing some rumblings out of DC that this might be the year that we see that, let alone an infrastructure bill. But I think that it would be a game changer for so many states.
Very good. Well, you guys can see that a whole bunch of people have popped up because they're very angry at everything that you guys have said. But let me go to Zach quickly, and then we'll go to the three people who have the most urgent comments and ideas. Zach, one of the things that's interesting here is that money, money has to come from somewhere to fund this stuff. You're a finance guy. Tell us a little bit about what you're thinking around this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Norman. Thanks for the opportunity to join today. At EmGlobal, I work with Derrick very closely as the Chief Investment Officer and Director of Evolutionary Finance, which I think, as you commented earlier, it's kind of an interesting journey as far as thinking about how to capitalize these projects. The reason that we have that lens is because, kind of taking it back to some of the things that Derrick and Shelley were saying, we do see the areas of development, specifically opportunity zones, this is where we do a lot of our work, as these emerging economies of North America. So when you compare a place like New Mexico, which is where we are, to New York City or San Francisco or Houston, it becomes very difficult to compete with those economies because it is a world of difference between what they need, what they have, and what they can access. The ESG investment landscape has never been more lucrative. It's since 2016 and 17 been growing at a pace of trillions of dollars a year, I think. Meaning that helping people has never been more financially lucrative. And when you think about smart city development and infrastructure development, you have an opportunity to provide some of these basic humanitarian efforts and also receive an investment return at the same time. What we would like to see from the federal government is this kind of an endorsement of the investment in these emerging economies, not necessarily through direct dollars, because what we think is that these economies themselves, once built out, should be able to rely on themselves to finance not only their own progression, but their expansion across the country and in different regions. To that end, I think that if you saw states, and Jen and I were talking about this yesterday, if you saw the government and states investing more towards the planning stages and looking at opportunity zones as a way to take certain things like infrastructure off their balance sheet and instead let it replace programs like tax increment financing, then what you would end up seeing is a phenomenon wherein the states and the governments were, first and foremost, they were taking the burden of maintaining roads and streets and water off of their plate and replacing it with investment in the front end of just the planning stages to say, this is how we're going to get this done with groups like ours and Matt's and Brian's around the country. After that, once you take that private capital, that is opportunity zones and other private capital, and build out that baseline infrastructure that you're talking about, the tax base that the governments see across the country, I think, again, is different. And it has the idea of impact metrics and what that means for them has to shift financially as well. So not only on the development side, what it means to have clean water and smart roads and broadband and 5G, but what that means for the actual municipalities and their bottom line. I think that there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about how much, from a financial perspective, the kind of advantage that these guys could have, and I say these guys, I mean the government, again, at all levels, could have from this kind of development. And it really is just a matter of tweaking their participation as far as what they're investing in, from hey, we're investing in roads and streets and infrastructure in the long term, to, look, we're going to create a master plan with very specific groups who have certain capabilities, and let them worry about that, and take advantage of the tax revenue that comes from those kinds of, I think someone said paradigm shift earlier, and that's what it really is. Convincing the U.S. to privatize infrastructure is no small chore, but if you show them where the economic advantages might be, I think that they would be a little bit more amenable to that discussion. So that would be our recommendation.
That's great. No, I appreciate that. So what I'm going to do now is go from earliest participant to latest. And so, David, you were on our first session this morning. If you're listening to me and your microphone's working, it'd be good to hear from you of what you, just tell everybody who you are quickly and then what you'd like to see happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So we our company Turbine, which is Terbine, we're building a global exchange for what's called Internet of Things data, and 5G and Edge are extremely critical to our rolling this out nationwide and eventually internationally. The one thing we're seeing is that there's not a lot of consistency in 5G coverage, and also things like sensors that cities install into their infrastructure. So the idea would be that with an infrastructure bill and the upgrading of things like power grids, water delivery, wastewater takeaway, of course, anything to do with traffic, pedestrians, making downtown areas more pedestrian friendly, bicycles, micromobility solutions, all of these things are going to rely heavily on talking to each other. And the way that'll happen is unquestionably 5G. It's something not easily done in the 4G world. So we're really keen on seeing 5G deployment, and not necessarily the government taking it over, just working with the telcos to create a very serious set of standards, if you will, for how 5G is deployed, as some of the people have been talking about.
Great, thanks so much, appreciate it. Lee, you're the next, you were on the panel right after David. It'd be interesting to hear from you. Lee Smith from Tennessee.
Yeah, Norm, I guess for one of my fellow panelists said it best, in this space, the state DOTs, the government, our part, or what we can do, is try to facilitate and try to deploy infrastructure, which we're trying to do. Our basic goal is, obviously, our mission is safety and mobility. So the infrastructure we deploy is advances or helps economic development in the in moving freight and safety for pedestrians and motorists. But what we're doing with our I-40 smart fiber project is to try to lay the groundwork for rural broadband in areas of Tennessee, so that we can start that conversation, we can advance the conversation, because we're putting in fiber optic communication, in this case in a 150-mile stretch of I-40 in West Tennessee. But all the things that have been discussed here, we got to pull these different pieces together, and the piece that the state government can pull is to try to deploy infrastructure and try to work the private-public partnerships to facilitate and to try to advance the discussion. We definitely have that as a goal and a mission on our side, to try to bring broadband to all areas of the state.
That's great. Really appreciate it. Now we have a special participation from the voice of God. Karin, you're on.
The voice of God, that's great. Good morning, everyone. Here are some of my thoughts, and I'm going to do this as if I'm riding up the elevator with President Biden, and I have my 30 seconds with him, and I want to be memorable and impactful. And there are three things that I talked to him about. One is, I think that we need flexible funding to address the broadband needs of unserved areas. And those unserved areas can be both rural and urban. In Washington State, it's definitely a rural issue, not only for rural counties, but our tribal governments, of which there are 27 statewide. And these unserved areas are rural and remote. And how they get served is going to be really tricky. And Shelley already mentioned this, but the return on investment in these rural unserved areas is dramatically different than it is elsewhere. And we need a new model to apply there so that we are applying things equitably. I will underscore the fact that I think block granting to states is a phenomenal idea. We in Washington are ready for that. We have a broadband assistance account that's just waiting for federal dollars for our board to deploy. The Public Works Board has a 35-year history of deploying infrastructure loans and grants to communities, and Shelley just mentioned our, demand exceeding our supply for broadband by 300%. We really want to do more. I want to say that too, I want to move on to the whole notion of equity. And the pandemic has really drawn this into the forefront. And I think it's affordability, access, and digital literacy. Our legislature is talking about this as 3 legs of a stool. Our governor just released yesterday his equity policy package. And so even more than that, our decision packages to get more funds for our broadband and our traditional program, we had to speak to equity in each of those. Digital, we as an infrastructure program, we can speak to the access and affordability. But the digital literacy is critically important for our children, for our communities, even for our older citizens. They all need to have that access, because what we're experiencing right now is a new normal, a bridging to a new normal. And everything in our economy and our communities is going to be so different in a post-pandemic world. I can't emphasize that enough. The other third point that I think is really critically important, and we've learned some of this through our deployment of our first round of broadband loans and grants, is the fact that we need to demonstrate that what's being proposed is technically feasible. And the resource in order to do that technical feasibility assessment is critically important. And beyond that, the timing of that vis-a-vis your application process is really important as well. And who does it and when they do it, super important. Our Utilities and Transportation Commission did it here in Washington State. I'm talking to you from Minnesota, but I'm as if I'm in Washington, the wonders of technology. At any rate, are underfunded to do this mission. And so this technical feasibility work also needs to be funded. We can't just think about deploying the infrastructure. We need to make sure that it's technically feasible so that the right solution is applied in each community, because it's hugely individualized. And sometimes, we're concerned in Washington State about overbill, and that we don't want to see duplication of investment in any area. But sometimes you need to be able to transect that middle mile in order to get to the unserved area, because there's a reason why the public sector has not funded that unserved area. And that's where government can step in to incentivize that investment and make it happen, so that those communities, be it tribal or rural, or even the ones that are redlined within an urban core, that have been historically redlined for decades, get that service that they need. So, Mr. President, that's what I do. Just give us, and I'm happy to help.
I got to get off of this elevator. This is a long ride.
It was, from the substrata of the Capitol building, and somehow we zigzagged over to the White House. So it was a magical mystery tour.
She wasn't going to let him go.
That was great.
Listen, I did that to Ed Markey when I happened upon him, when he was riding up the Senate elevator. And I said, Senator Markey. And he goes, yes. And I go, we're sort of related. And that was my in, because truly I'm sort of related to him. So it was a super, super, super opportunity. So
That's great. Well, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And we're going to keep going. Jen, you're next up. Tell us what your recommendation is. What are you thinking here?
Well, I'm going to give you a recommendation that I think is actually a tactful. We have to start actually building this. So we actually have to put a plan in. And there's 3 major things that I think are missing. And I have been intimately involved in building global networks around every country, around every state in this union, because I came from the payments industry. And there is a way to do this, and it's actually already begun. We need to plot the plan. You need to have what I call super nodes that are being invested in as far as the planning stage by the federal government, so that they align accordingly with each other. From those regions, they then should be inviting participants to create policy that will be able to connect these ancillary systems. Okay, so for instance, like in Tennessee, you have a wonderful effort over there. You have wonderful efforts going on the tribal lands that do need to be connected, but also they offer something. And I think people don't often look at this. They only look at urban centers as offering something, but I'll tell you, some of those lands are very good for environmental sensors. Okay, there's all kinds of technology that can be learned. We can learn from the education on those systems, but again, those are the data coming from those networks, whether it's transportation, education, healthcare, whatever, are the people's data. So the people have to buy into this idea that you are going to build something for them, okay? And if we don't have that buy-in, we're not going to be successful. So what's in it for them? Well, if you start creating regions that are already connected to arterial networks that are provided by the transportation agencies, you then can build what we call data marketplace hubs. Those hubs then connect to their ancillary systems. Those ancillary systems will then organically grow because the policies that were brought before the middle mile and the last mile will be able to be formed without really a lot of effort because there's already a big main line going through. They just have to connect to the line. So the idea is to provide them with a gateway system, which no one has talked about, but we need a gateway system to a platform that every industry can benefit from, because this is costly. You know, payment networks are very costly and they only work in financial information. So imagine we're going to be opening this up to all kinds of other data, right? Additionally, the way that you get this interest is you give ownership to the endpoints to the members who are going to use this system. So the more endpoints they get, the more data they create, the more opportunity they have to monetize that data through solutions like David has, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So bring them to an industry norm, which is providing a marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
We need to pay for the planning. No one wants to buck up that first dollar because the ROI sucks. Well, one way that they do this in the payment industry is they go about and they create a benchmark so that other systems that join on don't have to go through all the feasibility costs, right? So the first step of this nation needs to do is create a benchmark. Go pick out 10 cities out of those 10 regions that we pointed out earlier. You know, I would start with the ones that are very nearby autonomous testing stations because they're going to have a lot more data that we'll learn from, and then roll out from there. And then that requires policy. Have people in the industries define their policy because they'll know the standards that work. And eventually industries, just like cattle or hogs or lumber or oil, the participants are the secret to the success.
Yeah.
Because they want their industry to succeed.
Yeah.
And if we don't have any leadership in the administration, we're not going to get that done, because there is nothing that exists today that will take this digital infrastructure, which by the way underlies all infrastructure, all education, all healthcare, everything today. And we don't have any leadership. We need someone specifically to be able to cross those industry lines, to be able to cross the public-private, so we can bring in these partnerships, we can get private money to start financing this crap right out the door and go, because we're late to the game.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. Very good. Okay, so that's the pep talk. That should have been last. Yeah, you're getting a clap and everything. That should have been last though, because now I'm going to put some pressure on Jill and then we'll go to Jeff. But you got to keep up the same level of passion and energy that Jen just delivered, Jill.
Oh boy, that's a big marker. Hi everybody, I'm Jill Sorensen. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of EmTech, which is a military health acceleration intermediary. Our military sponsors support the work that we do. So in the health sector, a big area of focus is telemedicine. And as we've seen recently, without connectivity, much of that's compromised, and we know that it's mission critical. I'm based in Charleston. We're serving internationally military servicemen and women and veterans. And I've been working on electric vehicle infrastructure development for about a decade.
Can you hold the microphone closer to your mouth? We're having trouble hearing you clearly.
Oh dear. Okay, I'm sorry.
Just hold the microphone up to your mouth. Yeah.
Is this helpful?
That's more helpful for me. Yeah.
More helpful. Shall I repeat any of what I referenced? I'm based here in Charleston, South Carolina, working with the military to ensure health acceleration of products that are needed and services for military servicemen and women and veterans. And so one of the telemedicine initiatives that we're looking at that relates to this subject we're discussing is digital infrastructure. It's pretty hard to deliver telemedicine, right, without what these infrastructure elements.
Yeah.
And so, in response, John, to what you just alluded to, I'm wondering, I have a question. I would love to have a call to action specific enough, but for that, I want to say over 10 years, NIST and the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Transportation have been working on this very issue of cybersecurity and electric vehicle infrastructure development, which overlaps with energy storage and telecom. Are we not able to draw a plan yet out of that interdisciplinary initiative? Because I think we've got use cases. We've got VA hospitals, and we heard speakers just today talk about this is a great starting point, telemedicine, especially in light of COVID. If we were to choose use cases that speak to, Zach, your points about returns on investment, let's create an impact fund, could be seeded by the federal government, but inviting private markets in to help pay for the infrastructure and create more market opportunities through it. But we've done a decade of work on this. I'm just asking really the wisdom of this crowd in particular. Are we trying to reinvent something that may be just in piece parts in front of us?
Yeah, really interesting. So what I'm going to ask, we're going to go to you in a second, Jeff. I think what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of you all to send us your specific recommendations, and other people who are listening as well. I don't need a book, but a half a page or bulleted recommendations would be great. We're putting these into a white paper, then we'll send these back to you guys for your approval. We won't identify you guys as having specific recommendations, but just to make sure we got it right. And then we'll get that over to the Biden administration. We'll share it with you all, and you all can share it as well. I think, that's part of the message here, is that there's people all over the country with contacts to their local political representatives who are going to be very helpful in making this these recommendations move up to the state capitals and also to the White House, and hopefully we can do our job and move them down as well. Jeff, tell us what your recommendation is.
So first, Norm, I'd like to acknowledge that the leadership I've seen on all these panels is exceptional. I mean, I think you're pulling together people that really have the vision and the right aptitude to help drive the nation forward, because it's going to take a lot of pushing to get down the path. But I would say we are going to continue down the path where we are right now, which is really pushing the Digital Edge Infrastructure Act. And I think what we've already seen coming from Senator Warner and Cornyn and others is, I think it's starting to resonate, where they realize that edge infrastructure is vital for 5G. But I think we have to do a really good job of communicating that 5G has nothing to do with cities to begin with. Right now, if you look at all the applications of 5G people talk about in cities, it's how can they speed up the consumption of social media and YouTube. That is not going to create the industry of the future. In fact, industry, like I believe the rural community is what is going to drive the use of 5G. So rather than saying, oh, you guys get the crumbs of what 5G is going to bring, it should be growing up from the rural communities towards the cities, because the massive productivity gains that 5G is going to deliver is all about delivering autonomous systems, which are going to be in the agricultural fields. It's going to be in production in industrial refineries. We need to get bandwidth to the communities that are disconnected, that basically have the next, engineer, the next president, the next individual that needs to have that experience at their fingertips in their home while, they're happen to be in the middle of a rural community. And the best way I can equate this, if you look at the 1936 electrical build out, that's electrical rural community build out, was driving about how can we get electricity to the farmer. They got electricity to the farmer, not to the cities, so they could actually power their light bulbs and do all their little fancy parties. They got it to the farmer, and guess what happened? We experienced the largest productivity gain of any nation with agriculture. And if you look at the next Industry 4.0 is all about rural communities getting unlimited bandwidth, not 25 megabits. 25 megabits would have impressed me 20 years ago.
Right.
I mean, if we're not thinking about 1 gigabit or greater,
Right.
we are going to be so far behind China and other nations. We'll be a third world nation within the next 10 years.
Yep.
Yep.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's right. Listen, I'm going to leave the last word for Derrick, since Derrick started this, and then I'm going to ask you guys to please send us your recommendations. But I was talking to a social worker the other day who happens to be my wife, and she made the point that, you know, people can't educate their kids, right, in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, because they don't have access to fast enough broadband, and they don't have the equipment. You know, David was making that point earlier in the earlier session that, you know, we want to do all this stuff with smart cities, and we want to help cities monetize their data, except for cities have really old computer systems, and because of the virus, they're not going to invest in new computer systems for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Right. So there's really, you know, and so most of the discussion I hear from you guys is really about, it really is about a new economy that's coming, and we're really behind the 8 ball, but all the pieces are here, right? I mean, listening to Matt talk about block grants and what he's doing in Illinois, all the pieces are here to actually bring everybody together and to create, you know, I like the electricity is the example Jeff uses. I like the clean water example as well. You know, could you just imagine if, you know, your kids, you know, you're going to say, well, you can have clean enough water. What's clean enough water when the kid across the street has 1 gig water and you have 25, you know, megabyte water? I mean, is that clean enough? No, it's not clean enough. That's a big problem. So Derrick, I'll let you play us out.
Wow. Well, I want to echo Jeff in saying that this is a phenomenal group of people that you've been sort of putting together for this, and I think this is exactly just what's needed. You know, this is the only way that it's going to happen, I believe. And yes, all the pieces are there. It's a coordination effort, which I believe is what we're doing now. I think it's really, really fantastic. The comment earlier about literacy, I think that's key, in that we're a small group of people right now. We do have this sort of understanding. We do call ourselves to be digitally literate, but we're asking the federal government to also be digitally literate, right? Like that's a leap. Yep. To start to understand how data is valuable, and not just to private industry, but to the individuals. Yeah. And at that particular point, we can start to understand how data as a service is a utility. And once we establish that it's utility, then we can have the bottom sector of society raise up and start to be a bit more productive, and in some cases, the production angle within the United States.
Very good. I want to thank you guys. Thanks for participating throughout the day. I really appreciate it. It's great to see all you all as well. Hopefully we get to see each other in person someday. We used to do that. And thanks again. Thanks so much. And please send us your action item recommendations. And hopefully see you guys soon as well. Thanks so much for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.